What is the soul of an individualist? Today we discuss Ayn Rand's answer to that question. Welcome to the New Intellectual Book Study. I'm Cody Leibold, and we are looking at Howard Roark's courtroom speech in Ayn Rand's novel The Fountainhead. Our goal is to understand Ayn Rand's view of the nature of a healthy society, and the nature of a good and heroic man, a man that has the virtue of independence. In my version of the book, we are looking at pages 77 through 86. This is the book. You could also find it in the actual novel, The Fountainhead. So in today's sea of intellectual fog, Ayn Rand is offering us a vision of a man who is not second-handed. He discovers the truth and he lives by it, whatever it may cost him. In this week's discussion, we'll also raise some comparison points between what we see from Ayn Rand versus what we see in C.S. Lewis. This is the speech that Howard Roark makes in his own defense while on trial for having dynamited a government housing project under construction. He had designed the project for another architect, Peter Keating, on the agreement that it would be built exactly as he designed it. The agreement was broken by the government agency. The two architects had no recourse to law, not being permitted to sue the government. So it helps to understand that this character, Howard Roark, is Ayn Rand's portrayal of the ideal man. The Fountainhead, compared to some of Ayn Rand's other works, is a summary of her view on the correct inner psychology of a person. And we've mentioned this in the previous week, the theme of The Fountainhead being collectivism versus individualism in the soul of an individual person. And Howard Roark represents to Ayn Rand this heroic man who primarily thinks for himself and has an independent attitude. This independence is, for Rand, a key to understanding her view of virtue. To us, as readers that just maybe we've jumped in or maybe we're familiar with the story, we think, oh my goodness, he dynamited a building. But here is his defense. And this is not the only time that Rand has placed one of her heroes in front of a court. And because she seems to find poetry in that, she loved these courtroom scenes. So he stands in front of the I think it's a jury, and he's telling them, thousands of years ago, the first man discovered how to make fire. He was probably burned at the stake. He had taught his brothers to light. Through this first couple of paragraphs, you'll see some sentences that you might have seen just excerpted elsewhere, some pull quotes. He writes that he had left them a gift that they had not conceived, and he had lifted darkness off the earth. He describes this man. The unsubmissive and first stands in the opening chapter of every legend mankind has recorded about its beginning. Prometheus was chained to a rock and torn by vultures because he had stolen fire from the gods. This desire to go according to your own pursuit and understanding of truth, wherever it may take you, leads to a comparison between Prometheus and the hero of Ayn Rand. In fact, in the shorter story Anthem that we discussed previously, the character actually assumes the name Prometheus because he rediscovers the light bulb. So we've got a comparison here. Prometheus, this discoverer of light and fire, comparing it to Howard Roark. This vision of man is not exactly what we hear preached. And so as a Christian, and somebody who's been in church all my life, this is the kind of thing where I think, okay, very big contrast to be made between the kind of preaching that we hear and the kind of hero that Ayn Rand upholds. But does that mean that there is such a difference between this kind of heroic man versus Jesus Christ himself or God himself? Let's talk about the character of Jesus, the character of God, and what does Christ actually teach about morality? Compare that to Rand here, and you'll see that there's multiple ideas at play. Any interactions as we're moving into this discussion?
When Jesus says, what does it profit a man to gain the whole world but lose his soul? I think Howard Roark could have nodded, solemnly in agreement with that when he turned down the contract for I forget what it's called, it's been a while since I've read it. He turns down the contract that he needs to pay his bills, to keep his firm, to keep his practice open. And he says, no, you're conditioning this contract on the terms that I agree to compromise my artistic ideals And, I'm reading the Gospel of Luke right now, and that gospel, more than any other, could arguably be said to contain more sort of self-denial, renunciation. But I would say for every time it does that, it also says, great is your reward in heaven. And so there's not an inherent conflict yet between the two, although, of course, right after Prometheus, Roark says that Adam was another example of someone who mankind knew that its glory began with one, and that one paid for his courage. So that Adam was courageous in taking the fruit. And so I have comments about that, but I didn't know if you wanted to interact with the...
Yes, I left off right before that on purpose.
Okay.
So I agree with your observations about the book of Luke, for instance. I'll tell you, I went to Southern Seminary, which is an enormously collectivist seminary. And so I saw an article from my systematic theology teacher in Southern Seminary's magazine, and it talked about how the Protestant Reformation should be characterized in terms of we have changed instead of I. And they were purposely changing. Here I stand, no, it's here we stand. And in that article, they attacked individualism. So that was from Dr. Stephen Wellham, who taught my Systematic Theology Part 1. Compare that to the professor that I took for Systematic Part 2 and 3, Greg Allison. Guess what he named his son? Did he name his son Matthew? He named his son Luke. Now, compare that to when I took the New Testament survey. I took New Testament survey Part 1, which is supposed to be the 4 Gospels. Guess which 3 books we looked at for the 4 Gospels? We looked in depth at Mark, Luke, and John. Guess which one we never even looked at all? Matthew. Now there's a reason for that. Matthew, being the tax collector, is very interested in quantifying value. Whereas Luke, being the physician, is very interested in talking about the needs of others. And there are themes throughout Luke of the needs of others. And so if you already have this approach to Christianity that says, I believe in collectivism, you're going to want to talk about Luke all day. I once recorded a vocal project for a church. There's a collaboration between the seminary where I was in a choir and a church. The church was called Sojourn Collective. And guess what their CD was called? Songs from the Book of Luke. Of course. They always want to talk about Luke. And it's the passage where you get Jesus talks and he gives the beginning message of his ministry. I think it's in Luke 4. And he says that the Spirit of the Lord is upon me, and I'm going to proclaim liberty to the captives and to the oppressed. And they use that passage, and they take it out of context. At Southern Seminary, they love the book of Luke, at least in my experience. They didn't teach the book of Matthew, the book that talks about self-interest the most.
And by the way, what a self-interested statement, what a prideful in a holy sense statement in Luke 4. When he says, the Spirit of the Lord is upon me. By the way, this prophecy, I'm not ashamed to say, is about me. You're hearing it fulfilled in your hearing, to the point that they tried to kill him. They didn't try to kill him because he wanted to help poor people. They loved giving away their tithes to look great. I'm sure they loved giving handouts to poor people. That is one that does get thrown around a lot. So I think people aren't reading Luke closely enough.
Right. Yeah, there's nothing wrong with anything Luke said. Jesus in this situation is more of the Prometheus character. We can't compare Jesus to anybody ultimately, but if you were to say what is happening to him, the scenario is similar. Now, there is an error. Oh, go ahead, Greg.
Been reading Matthew a lot lately because I've been focusing on the parables for a story that I'm writing. And one thing I'm noticing with a lot of the parables is they almost seem like they interact with one another. Like you could almost imagine them as being a crossover. You have these themes of faithful servants and wicked servants, and a lot of agriculture. You have a lot of themes of a businessman going out and doing a capitalist venture. And it's something I've said to Christians before, and I had people get upset at me for saying this, but we routinely see Jesus comparing the kingdom of heaven to a capitalist endeavor. And and it's nice to see people nodding in agreement with me, because I've had people get, very, very upset, when I've pointed that out and say, well, I don't agree with your opinion. I'm like, well, I didn't give an opinion, I gave an observation. This is what we see in Scripture. We see the God figure in these parables, whether you want to call this the God figure or the, messianic figure, because at the end of the day, it's the same thing. We see that, hey, this is a businessman going out to make money, to make a profit, and you have faithful servants who are rewarded and unfaithful servants who are cast out.
That also strikes me as having a connection to the modern tradcon aversion to bankers. Did you notice that Jesus has a parable of the talents where he gives the 1 and the 2 and the 5 talents, and they are supposed to go out and make money with it? How do you make money with talents? Talents is an enormous amount of wealth. How do you make money? In the parable, he has the owner chastise the servant that only had 1 talent. And he says, you should have at least given it to the bank. So then now we have Christians today in the theonomy school or in the tradcon school that are saying all of the world's problems are due to the bankers and even to the Jews. This is some of the rhetoric on Gab lately. And it's like, do you worship the same Jesus that we have here? Because this Jesus did not prohibit people from lending money. And so we could talk a lot about Old Testament ethics on lending money and whether or not there was a misunderstanding about usury and those kinds of things. But you're absolutely right, Greg, to point out that in the New Testament, the picture is of building wealth and capitalism. Was
it In Pursuit of Wealth by Yaron Brook? Where the entire book is basically a defense of the finance industry?
That sounds like the book, yes.
I think that was one. And it's, I've been reading it, and it's been amazing that, you see this history of finance where, somebody gets a small loan to start a business, and the agreement up front is, hey, you get $300 to start a business, or $3,000 or $30,000 or whatever it is. And over the course of a year, you might have to pay it back with 10% interest. Or maybe 5 years or 10 years or whatever the case is. And a lot of people don't like that because they don't understand what's going on, that, hey, this person is benefiting from this, and more importantly, they agreed to it. It's not like the banker came to them and, at the point of a gun and said, you have to take this $30,000 loan. You have to go do this, and then you have to pay us back with interest. That's not what's happening. It's a mutually agreed upon contract, and both parties get richer in the process.
Yeah, as Christians are thinking through that issue, definitely check out Yaron Brook's discussion of that. And I think that there's multiple ways that you can understand some of the Old Testament principles. Like, for instance, I think that the prohibitions against taking interest or usury that you see sometimes I think it's in Deuteronomy and Leviticus, those are describing, at least as far as I understand it, the specific situation of lending in a predatory fashion to the poor, which is not the same as investing in a joint business venture and then taking profits from that the way we do when we invest in the stock market. So, just the people that are opposed to the stock market as such, or investment banking, I don't think that they're really taking a full picture of what the Bible is saying about those issues, especially in light of the fact that Jesus here in the New Testament talks about it as a positive. So, all right, let's go forward in the reading. There's this error that I wanted to bring up. An error from the Objectivists. You see this from all of them, and it started with Rand, I believe. Roark has just compared himself to Prometheus, and now Roark compares himself to Adam sinning. He says Adam was condemned to suffer because he had eaten the fruit of the tree of knowledge. Whatever the legend, somewhere in the shadows of its memory, mankind knew that its glory began with one, and that one paid for his courage. So there may be some psychological correct observation here that people do realize that there was some thing in the past that happened, and that choice that was made by one individual affected everybody else. Could be. I wouldn't dispute it. It sounds like evidence that people have listened to their forefathers throughout the years, that they've heard the original story. But the Objectivists try to characterize what Adam did as first of all, he sought knowledge, and he was cursed for that. And then after that, we know in Genesis 3, it describes how Eve would have a desire for her husband. The Objectivists twist that, and they say, well, sexual desire is a result of the fall according to Christianity. And then God makes them work, and therefore they say productive work is a result of the fall according to the Christians. That's not in the text at all. I don't see that at all. So their idea that Adam was condemned to suffer because he had eaten the fruit of the tree of knowledge, well, it wasn't just knowledge. Remember, it was knowledge of good and evil. It was the experiential knowledge of disobedience. And God told them ahead of time, that's the tree that will give you the experiential knowledge of disobedience. if you disobey. It's a whole different thing than the way that the objectivists would want to characterize it. They get original sin wrong as a concept, and they get the account of Adam and Eve wrong as a concept. No surprise there. Discussion before we move to the next section?
Sure. I've always struggled with exactly interpreting what is it that happened. What is it that was the knowledge of good and evil in that passage? One alternative way of looking at it that Owen Anderson put out that I found interesting was that God says, now they're like one of us, knowing good and evil. And he says, if you think about it, how does God, and again, I'm not necessarily endorsing this view, I think it's just one worth thinking about. How does God know good and evil? By making it. God makes creatures with a certain nature. He makes humans with a human nature, and that's what defines morality for them. It's not just a divine command theory. And so God knows good and evil by making it as such. And so he says, yeah, now humans are trying to do that. They're trying to know good and evil as God does by making it what their whims want it to be. What they wish it was, by trying to make it so. The difference is humans can't do that because as God makes the world what it is, we are to perceive the world and to reason about what it is. And that's actually how we become the Prometheus in the story. So Adam's actually the opposite in this version. Adam's saying Adam could have been Prometheus. He was supposed to be Prometheus in this way of looking at it. And instead he said, I'm not going to try to subject my mind I'm not going to try to conform my mind to reality. I'm going to try to conform reality to my mind. He made the Kantian switch there. But that's one way of looking at what did Adam do. He actually should have been Prometheus. He should have been making the fire to fuel civilization. And in fact, it's interesting that you see just one chapter later in Genesis, it's very quickly, it's not very much time before people start inventing, bronze working, iron working, people starting to invent sort of things. And I'm sure Greg knows more about that than I do, having studied that a lot more. But I think there's a big contrast there between the way they're portraying it, Roark is portraying it here, and Objectivists portray it in the way it really is.
I agree. That's well said. Yeah, Adam could have been quite the hero for all of mankind. Of course, God foresaw exactly what was going to happen, but what a bad decision there. It's interesting also to compare God's knowledge of good and evil to the kind that Adam and Eve could possess. I think that God will never sin. God will never experience being a sinner, if you could even use the word experience to describe how God is in reality. But the experience of Adam of becoming a sinner, that was that knowledge that God was talking about. And there was no gain for that. Go ahead, Greg.
Yeah, I think it's important to point out that, it's not, the tree of knowledge. It's the tree of knowledge of good and evil. And so there's a bit of a straw man here, where it's not, knowledge as such is not the problem. And, even when, Adam was in the garden, he worked the garden. So, this idea that I seem to see with objectivists is like, it's as if people were just floating around in the garden, not working on this, divine welfare type thing, never working, never thinking, and just floating around.
It's interesting, some of the people that have tried to shoot me down in public, when I ask them questions about what their views are, they'll say, oh, well, you're just one of those Ayn Rand Christians, so that's laughable and useless. But the discussion that we're actually having today demonstrates the value of engaging with Ayn Rand's ideas, because this is someone critical of some of Christian tradition, some of Christian thought, and the schools of thought that have developed around Christianity. Looking at a serious critique of Christianity will help Christians. I think this would be a good time for us to look at the C.S. Lewis material. This is an article that Jacob Brunton wrote several years back, and Jacob is traveling today, so he wasn't able to be on the video, but he wrote this article called Selfish Love with C.S. Lewis and Ayn Rand. So how's that for a provocative title? Selfish Love with C.S. Lewis and Ayn Rand. And he quotes C.S. Lewis in The Weight of Glory. This is an extended quote, I'll just read it. If you asked 20 good men today what they thought the highest of the virtues, 19 of them would reply unselfishness. That was in 1940s the answer, even in a nominally Christian society, that unselfishness was the highest virtue. But if you asked almost any of the great Christians of old, he would have replied, love. You see what has happened. A negative term has been substituted for a positive. The negative ideal of unselfishness carries with it the suggestion not primarily of securing good things for others, but of going without them ourselves, as if our abstinence and not their happiness was the important point. I do not think that this is the Christian virtue of love. And then he goes on, there's a little bit more. I had to skim down. Lewis writes, the New Testament has lots to say about self-denial, but not about self-denial as an end in itself. And that's the nuance that we need here. We are told to deny ourselves and to take up our crosses in order that we may follow Christ. And nearly every description of what we shall ultimately find if we do so contains an appeal to desire. If there lurks in most modern Christians the notion that to desire our own good and earnestly to hope for the enjoyment of it is a bad thing, I submit that this notion has crept in from Kant and the Stoics, and is no part of the Christian faith. Indeed, if we consider the unblushing promises of reward, and the staggering nature of the rewards promised in the Gospels, it would seem that our Lord finds our desires not too strong, but too weak. Another little famous section here. We are half-hearted creatures fooling around with drink and sex and ambition, when infinite joy is offered us, like an ignorant child who wants to go on making mud pies in the slum, because he cannot imagine what is meant by the offer of a holiday at sea. We are far too easily pleased. In Jacob's article, which I recommend anybody check it out, it's at our blog, Selfish Love, you can just Google search, Selfish Love, Jacob Brenton. You'll see he compares that view with Ayn Rand's view on love, and points out that in Rand's view, and you'll see this in The Fountainhead and in what Roark says about it, that you cannot really have a selfless love. So check out that article if you want to see the connection between Lewis and Rand. And Lewis is absolutely right about the connection to Kant and the connection to the Stoics. He's not making things up. Well, let's go on in the reading. We have a fairly short reading today in comparison to some of the other readings. We are on 77. This is one of the most famous lines. Throughout the centuries, there were men who took first steps down new roads armed with nothing but their own vision. That was good enough that I think that there's a plaque in Disneyland or something that says that. And interestingly, Ayn Rand and Walt Disney knew each other, I believe. I think they were both strongly anti-communist, and they were both very interested in creativity around the same time in the 1950s. The great creators, the thinkers, the artists, the scientists, the inventors stood alone against the men of their time. And I can't help but hear Gary Cooper in the Fountainhead film saying these things. Gary Cooper, another strong anti-communist from that time. Every new invention was denounced. The first motor was considered foolish. The airplane was considered impossible. The power loom was considered vicious. Anesthesia was considered sinful. But the men of unborrowed vision went ahead. They fought, they suffered, and they paid, but they won. No creator was prompted by a desire to serve his brothers. Skipping, his truth was his only motive, his own truth and his own work to achieve it in his own way. This is not subjectivism, by the way. He's talking here in a poetic form. He could, in a philosophically more specific way, he could say not his own truth, but his own grasp of the objective truth. Moving forward, his own truth and his own work to achieve it in his own way, a symphony, a book, an engine, a philosophy, an airplane, or a building. That was his goal and his life. The creation, not its users. The creation, not the benefits others derive from it. The creation which gave form to his truth. He held his truth above all things and against all men. It reminds me of discussions we've had with Isaac Adams, where he talked about how he is a computer programmer, but he doesn't primarily do the work for the user. He does the work because he enjoys working, because he values being a worker. And he's not ultimately resting his motivations and values in other people. His vision, his strength, his courage came from his own spirit. A man's spirit, however, is his self, that entity which is his consciousness. To think, to feel, to judge, to act are functions of the ego. The creators were not selfless. It is the whole secret of their power, that it was self-sufficient, self-motivated, self-generated. skipping ahead, man cannot survive except through his mind, and skipping again, everything we are and everything we have comes from a single attribute of man, the function of his reasoning mind. But the mind is an attribute of the individual. There is no such thing as a collective brain. There is no such thing as a collective thought. An agreement reached by a group of men is only a compromise or an average drawn by many individual thoughts. It is a secondary consequence. The primary act, the process of reason, must be performed by each man alone. Anyone that's watched our Objectivism book study has seen this fleshed out in greater detail, but this is a powerful summary of Ayn Rand's epistemology and her metaphysic. No man can use his brain to think for another. What we receive from others is only the end product of their thinking. The moving force is the creative faculty which takes this product as material, uses it, and originates the next step. That which it creates is the property of the creator. There are some connections here to these epistemological concepts and the discussion that is going on right now among the national conservatives about whether or not tradition is a source of knowledge. Each individual person must use their reasoning capacities, and there's emphasis on that in Rand, and it's lacking in the discussion from national conservatives such as Yoram Hazony. Moving forward. And here man faces his basic alternative. He can survive only one of two ways: by the independent work of his mind, or as a parasite fed by the minds of others. The creator originates, the parasite borrows. The creator faces nature alone, the parasite faces nature through an intermediary. Now, from our first discussion of this book, when we were looking at the essay called For the New Intellectual, we talked about these archetypes: the Attila, the witch doctor, and then the man of the mind, the producer. And so this speech connects in many details with that idea, this idea of the second-handers versus the producer. The creator lives for his work. He needs no other men. His primary goal is within himself. The parasite lives second-hand. He needs others. Others become his prime motive. The basic need of the creator is independence. For a while, Rand toyed with the idea that independence was the essence of virtue. Later, she took a step back and realized that independence is just one example of a broader theme of rationality, and she would position rationality as the essence of virtue. But independence would be probably the first that she'd want to discuss when you look at the subspecies of that. So the basic need of the creator is independence. The reasoning mind cannot work under any form of compulsion. It cannot be curbed, sacrificed, or subordinated to any consideration whatsoever. It demands total independence in function and in motive. To a creator, all relations with men are secondary. The basic need of the second-hander is to secure his ties with men in order to be fed. That would be the Attila and the witch doctor. He places relations first. He declares that man exists in order to serve others, which is the witch doctor's theme. He preaches altruism. Okay, so now we are discussing the actual concept at the heart of what Roark is going against. Altruism is the doctrine which demands that man live for others and place others above self. No man can live for another. He cannot share his spirit, just as he cannot share his body. The man who attempts to live for others is a dependent. He is a parasite in motive and makes parasites of those he serves. The relationship produces nothing but mutual corruption. This connects also to the speech that we saw from Ellsworth M. Toohey in the previous week, how Toohey decided by altruism to corrupt people's souls. Men have been taught that the highest virtue is not to achieve but to give. Yet one cannot give that which has not been created. Creation comes before distribution, or there will be nothing to distribute. The need of the creator comes before the need of any possible beneficiary. An interesting comparison you could make between that idea is in modern economics, they often discuss how, as a starting axiom of economics, we discuss that there is scarcity of materials, and economics studies the distribution of those materials. Excuse me, what about the creation? What about how did the materials get created and who creates them? Men have been taught that their first concern is to relieve the suffering of others. Remember the connection I made between the collectivists and their love of the book of Luke? Well, men have been taught that their first concern is to relieve the suffering of others. But suffering is a disease. Should one come upon it, one tries to give relief and assistance. To make that the highest test of virtue is to make suffering the most important part of life. Then man must wish to see others suffer in order that he may be virtuous. Such is the nature of altruism. The Creator is not concerned with disease, but with life. Yet the work of the creators has eliminated one form of disease after another. In man's body and spirit, and brought more relief from suffering than any altruist could ever conceive. Men have been taught that it is a virtue to agree with others, but the Creator is the man who disagrees. I think we have a key issue there. The Creator is the man who disagrees. We're going on to the top of page 81, and this is, I'll just read a couple more lines and then we'll discuss. Men have been taught that the ego is the synonym of evil, and selflessness the ideal of virtue, but the Creator is the egoist in the absolute sense. And the selfless man is the one who does not think, feel, judge, or act. These are functions of the self. As poles of good and evil, he was offered two conceptions, egoism and altruism. Egoism was held to mean the sacrifice of others to self, altruism the sacrifice of self to others. This tied man irrevocably to other men and left him nothing but a choice of pain, his own pain borne for the sake of others or pain inflicted upon others for the sake of self. Man was forced to accept masochism as his ideal, under the threat that sadism was his only alternative. This was the greatest fraud ever perpetrated on mankind. And to skip a line, he says, the choice is not self-sacrifice or domination. The choice is independence or dependence. The code of the Creator or the code of the second-hander. This is the basic issue. So, strong claim here. The basic issue that men must face ethically in their relationship to society is, will you be a second-hander or will you be an independent man? That is the key. All that which proceeds from man's independent ego, says Roark here, is the good. All that proceeds from man's independent ego is good. All that which proceeds from man's dependence upon men is evil. Strong claim. The egoist in the absolute sense is not the man who sacrifices others. He is the man who stands above the need of using others in any manner. He does not function through them. He is not concerned with them in any primary matter. Not in his aim, not in his motive, not in his thinking, not in his desires, nor in the source of his energy. He does not exist for any other man, and he asks no other man to exist for him. This is the only form of brotherhood and mutual respect possible between men. Okay, that was the bulk of what I wanted to read from the speech. There will be more in a bit, but let's discuss. Thoughts so far?
I think there's two sort of good straw men that pop up here that Roark sort of / Rand sort of deals with right here. One is that the alternative to altruism is sort of stepping on other people, and that I think it's important that she takes the time to say those aren't the only two alternatives, and that's really the greatest obstacle to her message rhetorically, is saying, oh, so you aren't for just submitting to everyone else around you, so you must be for putting yourself above them in a social sense and say you're more important than them, and that they should just move out of the way for you. And getting rid of that false dichotomy is really important for her, and I'm glad that she does it. Another one is sort of implied here, but she goes into it in more depth elsewhere, which is it's easy if you're sort of inherently if you're predisposed to dislike what she's saying here, you're going to take all the second-hander language and say, oh, so if I'm not an inventor, if I'm not a genius, if I'm not inventing new things, and I work for an employer, then I guess I'm just, a little, grubby-handed second-hander, worth nothing. When she would say, no, you can be the independent type and be a secretary. You could be a stenographer. You could be a janitor, even. Think about the work that Hugh Axton did making burgers. He was the philosopher king, basically. But it's not about, am I the greatest inventor? It's whatever I'm doing. Am I offering value for what I get? Am I putting forth my best effort using my mind in what I'm doing? And am I acting as if others owe me the living I'm making? Or is my primary approach, I need to work to earn what I make, even if I'm the lowliest person on the totem pole in the whole company, or if I'm the CEO? I should have the same approach. It's easy to for people to sort of make a straw man of Rand that she's only for CEOs, and she's only for inventors and the best of the best. Yeah, she props those people up, but she also has all these characters. If you look at who's in the courtroom, if you back up in the scene in the Fountainhead, who else is there? Mike,
The general contractor.
the contractor. He's not the great man by sort of the world standards, but she props him up saying, oh, he's the person he's got an honest judgment. Even look at her description of the jurors that Roark wanted on the jury. They're just sort of hard-faced people, kind of going about their day, just the average person trying to make their own judgments about the world. I think those are just important clarifications to make because it's easy to fall into this. You see Ayn Rand sort of mischaracterized more than I feel like any other writer is in terms of writers of her importance.
We should discuss that mischaracterization. I have a note right here at the bottom of this page because I just recently read a book called Conservatism. It's by Roger Scruton, Sir Roger Scruton, who recently passed away. And in his book, I think in the 5th chapter, he describes, maybe it's the 6th chapter, he describes Ayn Rand's thought. And he does it in a way that he is, I would say I'm thankful that he mentions her importance in the mid-20th century in the conservative movement. And he talks about the conflict that Rand had with William Buckley. But whenever he's describing Rand's thought, this is one of the leading conservative thinkers in recent years. He describes Rand's thought as if he was a teenager who had heard somebody describe Rand in a conversation secondhand, and he describes her as Nietzschean. And I don't think he's even read this speech. I don't think he's even read The Fountainhead. From the way that he misrepresents Rand's views, I don't think that he shows any evidence of having read a single word written by her, but rather only just recycling the criticisms that he heard from the people at National Review who were scoundrels, like Whittaker Chambers. And so he's not the only one. I recently listened to an audio recording from an important Christian thinker, Ronald Nash. Ronald Nash has some good ideas. I think he's passed away now, but he's a thinker in the last several decades that's of some consequence. And his representation of Ayn Rand likewise showed that he had not given her a first-handed treatment. I don't think he read her personally. Or if he did, he didn't read her enough. Now, somebody that actually did read Rand is John W. Robbins, and he wrote a book called Without a Prayer, and he strongly criticized Rand's system. I think he's coming at it from a presuppositionalist point of view, and his criticism of Rand, likewise, I've read his book, and he doesn't understand fundamentally what Rand's claims are. He at least tried, but his book is useless because he so fundamentally misunderstands Rand's claims. He doesn't engage with her on the level of the claims that she's making. So, this is the story of Ayn Rand's reception. One of my goals is to be, as a Christian and a writer, somebody who understands Rand's ideas and can accurately represent them. And that doesn't mean that they're all right, but there's been a great injustice against her views. And we can see why. Because most people that are on the collectivist premise would be threatened by her views, and they would be repulsed. So they would be repulsed that they would not read, and they'd be threatened enough that they would angrily misrepresent. And it's just not acceptable. There needs to be a change. Go ahead, Greg.
I could see where, somebody might, get that impression at first that, Ayn Rand is, exalting like the Rockefellers of the world, and that's it. But I mean, it's so much more than that. And like if you read, I'm on my 3rd time reading through Atlas Shrugged, and I don't think that. I don't think that's the whole point of what she's saying. So I agree. And it's are you somebody who is going and building a life for yourself? It's like some people are going to be smarter than others in this world. Different people are going to have different gifts. The average millionaire out there was a C student. Just because we all can't be, Rockefellers or Teslas or Galts or whoever the figure may be. I mean, that doesn't necessarily mean we're lesser people. It just means this is an ideal representation of somebody who thinks for themselves and somebody who subdues the earth beneath their feet. You could be somebody who just goes out there, you get a good job, and you establish a life for yourself. And I think that's more what we're getting at. And one example, I'll throw it out there real quick, is, when I was in the Miami area, I saw so many people who came from, this island or that country. And so a lot of people were coming to the Miami area from places that are in poverty. It seemed like most of the people I ran into were Cuban. So a lot of Cuban people, a lot of Jamaican people, a lot of Haitian people, a lot of people from Central and South America, and they're coming there and they're going after the American dream. And they're making it happen for themselves. And when I would talk to people about, what do you think about AOC pushing socialism, or these people who say that, minorities can't get ahead in America, they would look at me like I had two heads. Like, it was just insane to them, the idea that, somebody can't get ahead in America just because, they have a darker complexion, or just because, they came from a different country. Because I looked around and people were very wealthy and they were doing very well for themselves. They may not, like I said, not everybody can be Rockefeller, but you had people opening ice cream businesses and making a ton of money doing that. So, and you also had people who were just, hey, I want to go pursue this particular career field, or I want to be a stay-at-home mom, or I want to be, whatever the thing was for them, that made their life what they wanted it to be. But the point wasn't, that you have to be a great capitalist. The point was, taking care of your own life and pursuing the life that you want to have and stewarding that life.
It's just the basic dominion mandate that you would be fruitful and multiply, just like we've been talking about. All right, I'm on 82 in this speech, and this is another extended section, not quite as long as the last. So Roark says independence is the only gauge of human virtue and value. Now, that's a really strong claim. I think independence in this sense means independent action by objective standards, the requirements of man's life. So you could almost squeeze into that rationality. Rationality is the only gauge of human virtue and value, but here he means independently applying your mind. It's the only gauge of human virtue and value. Now he says, in all proper relationships there is no sacrifice of anyone to anyone. He says, men exchange their work by free mutual consent to mutual advantage when their personal interests agree and they both desire the exchange. If they do not desire it, they are not forced to deal with each other. I'm sure the conservatives will come in and say, oh, but you're not thinking about families. Families obviously sacrifice to each other. In one sense, the children are slaves to the parents, and in the other sense, the parents are slaves to the children. We're not talking about that. We're talking about social interactions among adults. No work is ever done collectively by a majority decision. Every creative job is achieved under the guidance of a single individual thought. An architect requires a great many men to erect his building, but he does not ask them to vote on his design. Skipping ahead, first right on earth is the right to the ego. Man's first duty is to himself. His moral law is never to place his prime goal within the person of others. So there is a strong claim that many pastors and Christian thinkers would have a difficulty with. His moral law is never to place his prime goal within the persons of others. I think that many people that have gone wrong, say pastors that made bad decisions and ended up throwing their life away, their problem was that over a period of decades, they put their prime goal within the persons of others. And they found that that led to a lack of motivation. And that led to psychological problems, which eventually leads to immorality and stuff like that. So his moral obligation is to do what he wishes, provided his wish does not depend primarily on other men. This includes the whole sphere of his creative faculty, his thinking, his work, but it does not include the sphere of the gangster, the altruist, and the dictator. A man thinks and works alone. A man cannot rob, exploit, or rule alone. Robbery, exploitation, and ruling presuppose victims. They imply dependence. They are the province of the second-hander. Rulers of men are not egoists. They create nothing. They exist entirely through the persons of others. Their goal is in their subjects, in the activity of enslaving. They are as dependent as the beggar, the social worker, and the bandit. Notice the connection to Rand's previous description of Attila. Top of page 83 for me. Men were taught to regard second-handers, tyrants, emperors, dictators as exponents of egoism. Sir Roger Scruton seems to have thought that that was what Rand was getting at. By this fraud they were made to destroy the ego. From the beginning of history, the two antagonists have stood face to face, the creator and the second-hander. When the first creator invented the wheel, the first second-hander responded. He invented altruism. So then Rand goes and describes this paradigm of the individual versus the collective. The common good of a collective, a race, a class, a state, was the claim and justification of every tyranny ever established over men. Every major horror of history was committed in the name of an altruistic motive. Consider the recent horrors that we've faced. It's the year 2022. What horrors has the United States faced? With gross inflation and lockdowns and pressuring people by threat of losing their job to receive a new experimental treatment which may have damaging consequences. Was that not all done under the banner of altruism? Did the writers at The Atlantic not tell us that it was the people that were anti-vaxxers that were a threat to society, that they needed to be trampled and stomped because they were dangerous, because they were so hateful toward other people? Was that not the message that we've been hearing? Did we not hear, we're all in this together? The altruistic motive, a pretense for control and enslaving other people. Roark says, has any act of selfishness ever equaled the carnage perpetrated by disciples of altruism? Does the fault lie in men's hypocrisy or in the nature of the principle? The most dreadful butchers were the most sincere. They believed in the perfect society reached through the guillotine and the firing squad. If you know your history, you know that he is not lying. Roark goes on, actors change, but the course of the tragedy remains the same. A humanitarian who starts with declarations of love for mankind and ends with a sea of blood. Now we're at the bottom of this page. The only good which men can do to one another, and the only statement of their proper relationship, is hands off. In other words, laissez-faire. That's French for hands off. Laissez-faire capitalism. Now observe the results of a society built on the principle of individualism. This, our country, the noblest country in the history of men, the country of greatest achievement, greatest prosperity, greatest freedom. This country was not based on selfless service, sacrifice, renunciation, or any precept of altruism. It was based on man's right to the pursuit of happiness. His own happiness, not anyone else's. A private, personal, selfish motive. Look at the results. Look into your own conscience. I'll stop there for a moment. Any comments on that? Go ahead, Greg.
Real quick, I'll throw out, John 15:13, because I'm sure that, verses like this are going to come up in the minds of, any Christian watching this. ESV, it says, greater love has no one than this, that someone lay down his life for his friends. And, somebody can look at this and say, oh, well, that's altruism. That's for the sake of others. But I think you have a huge difference between Kant's altruism, where, Kant said the highest moral virtue is, sacrificing for the sake of others with no benefit for yourself. But what we see here is very, very different. It's someone laying down his life for his friends, for somebody he cares about. And I think that's the difference. I think if Rand says, there's no sacrifice involved, I don't agree with her there, because there is sacrifice involved when you care about someone. But I think she's not properly using the word sacrifice. I don't think she's defining it properly.
Yes, there's more than one definition there. Is it a trade up? Is it a trade down by definition? It just depends. And I would say that I don't disagree with Rand's use of the term. I just think that we need to be careful to understand which way she's using it. And you're right. In the Bible and in Jesus' words, he's talking about love. Whereas Kant is not talking about love. Kant is talking not about your personal desire and your personal values. He's talking about your duties that are imposed externally on you. And that's his definition. External duty means sacrifice for others for their own sake. And the more other they are, the less value you have in them, the more moral the sacrifice is. That's completely inconsistent with Jesus talking about the love that we have for our friends. Well, we're in the last couple pages of the reading. So this is Roark saying civilization is the progress toward a society of privacy. Notice how inconsistent that is with the idea of the National Conservatives. or the Christian nationalists today. Civilization is the progress toward a society of privacy. A savage's whole existence is public, ruled by the laws of his tribe. Civilization is the process of setting man free from men. He goes on, in our age, collectivism, the rule of the second-hander and the second-rater, the ancient monster, is broken loose and is running amok. It is engulfing our country. I am an architect. I know what is to come by the principle on which it is built. We are approaching a world in which I cannot permit myself to live. Now you know why I dynamited Cortland. I designed Cortland. I gave it to you. I destroyed it. I destroyed it because I did not choose to let it exist. It was a double monster, in form and in implication. I had to blast both. The form was mutilated by two second-handers who assumed the right to improve upon that which they had not made and could not equal. They were permitted to do it by the general implication that the altruistic purpose of the building superseded all rights, and that I had no claim to stand against it. I agreed to design Cortland for the purpose of seeing it erected as I designed it, and for no other reason. That was the price I set for my work. I was not paid. Skipping ahead, he says, who permitted them to do it? No particular man among the dozens in authority. No one cared to permit it or stop it. No one was responsible. No one can be held to account. Such is the nature of all collective action. By the way, I've just been reading Yoram Hazony's book about the American founding and about conservatism. And that is a debated issue in political theory is, should the country be run by a committee or should it be run by a single executive? And there were arguments around the time of the Constitution about that. And as you know, what won out was the idea that there should be a single executive. And the arguments for that are that if you have a committee, then ultimately in the background, you do have someone that's one or two people that are making the main decisions, but they're influencing others in ways that are more obscure to the public. And therefore it makes it difficult to keep them accountable. Whereas if you have a single executive, a president, then if one of the people that he has in his cabinet is acting in a way that's inappropriate, it shines on the president, and the president will be held accountable. At least in those days, they thought that that was the way it would work. So they had a good argument for why you should not have rule by committee. You should have an executive. Even in the United States, when they were so concerned about the accumulation of power to one man, they decided that you needed to have somebody in charge. Now, this is a principle that we see played out in human relationships today. Have you ever been at a party where nobody wanted to be in charge of the party? Or on a group date where nobody wanted to be in charge? So people just drift, and it's like the scene in Atlas Shrugged, where there's the boardroom, and nobody wants to take responsibility. It's actually much better to have somebody who is the master of ceremonies. Like, remember in the feast at Cana, in Jesus' first miracle, there was a master of the feast. Was that master like a tyrant? No, he was just the master of the feast. And so he was the one that was in charge of making sure everybody was having a good time, and everybody knew it. This is not rocket science to know that there needs to be somebody in charge in order for things to go forward.
I come from a hometown that has a whole paradox named after it. My hometown, Abilene. Have you heard of the Abilene paradox? It's about, a group of friends. They don't know what to do. One person thinks everyone else would like to go to Abilene. This is back when Abilene was like the big city. And the second person says, I don't really want to do that, but I know everyone else probably does. So they say, yeah, sure, I'll do it. Every single person does the same thing. No one wants to go, but they all think that everyone else does. And that's another good illustration of that principle. And I think the flip side of that is that, sometimes at certain points, this is obviously a heightened speech. It's accentuating the points it's making. You might get the sense that Roark thinks, well, other people are only like of incidental importance in his life. But if you read how he talks to Dominique earlier, it's true that for him, his relationship to others is built on his understanding of himself and his own values and who he is. But there's not like a big gulf there necessarily between that foundation of who he is and how important Dominique or his other friends are to him. They might be this close, but it's always because I know who I am and what I value, that's how I can value you. There's not necessarily this big giant gulf like, oh, I'm going to work. This is another misconception about individualism. It's about, I just don't want to do other things with other people. No, it's a way of working with other people. It's actually individualism is a way of relating to others. Quite frankly, it makes for much more pleasant relationships when you know that you're not being forced or coerced or anything to be in those friendships and in those friend groups and in those relationships.
Yes, and there's no need for pretense about your motives. You don't need to pretend to your wife that the reason why you're doing something is because you care more about her than about yourself. You can just be completely transparent and say, I care about this because I want to have a good marriage, I want to have a good life, and so therefore I'm serving you here in this way. Or therefore I'm going to insist on having my way today, or I'm going to let you have your way today. It's all because I value my life. And you can look at each other and honestly, it's almost like being naked because it's so different compared to the way that most people dress up and put a facade and a mask and try to characterize their thought process as being other-centered when it's not really. It's all just dishonesty. Go ahead, Greg.
Yeah, I had a friend that, when I first was being exposed to these ideas, I mentioned to him, like, hey, if I told you that, I was friends with you out of charity, because I felt sorry for you, what would you say to that? And it was very much a hypothetical, and I made it very clear that it was hypothetical. And he looked at me and said, I wouldn't want to be friends with you anymore. And that was something that I really appreciated because, sometimes I get worried that other people are friends with me out of charity. And I've done that with people before where I've been, friends with somebody not because I actually found them interesting or anything, just because it was basically because I felt sorry for them. And it was in college when I basically stopped doing that. I said, this is not a good thing. I don't have time for this. And I just stopped doing that. I said, if I'm going to hang out with people, I'm going to hang out with people that I enjoy. And at the time I said, okay, this is going to be a temporary thing, but then I never went back. I said, if I'm going to have friends, I'm going to make sure that I am genuinely friends with the person. It's somebody I genuinely enjoy and, genuinely care about, and who, I'm hopefully having a mutual exchange of enjoyment with that person.
I love that. I have heard similar accounts of that, especially around the age of college, because people have become more philosophical and they've realized that they have a certain ethical code and they want to live it out. And so they will be, like you said, an altruistic friend. And yeah, I really appreciate you pointing that out because, when you become a friend to somebody for fake reasons, because you feel sorry for them or something, you're depriving them of the chance to find somebody to interact with, to become friends with, that actually enjoys being with them. Because you're taking up their time. And you're taking up their time feeding them false affirmation when they could be finding somebody that actually has more interests in common with them. Same for if you were to marry somebody that you didn't really love or were not really attracted to. Like, what if there was somebody that was attracted to them and you just butted in order to be an altruist? It's so dumb. What we're talking about here is not that we should not love people. It's that we should have an integrated approach to love. What Andrew was saying earlier about Howard Roark actually loves Dominique. He has an integrated understanding of her place within his life. That integrated understanding is what we're getting at here. By the way, I was going to mention one other thing about that paradox. It's exactly what Ellsworth Toohey says in the speech that we read last week about how everybody is just attempting to guess what's in the mind of everybody else. So I think that that's a perfect picture. Let's go to the last couple of sentences here in the reading that I'll just excerpt. This is 85. Roark says, "They took the benefit of my work and made me contribute it as a gift. But I am not an altruist. I do not contribute gifts of this nature. It is believed that the poverty of the future tenants gave them a right to my work." Notice that theme that need constitutes a claim on others. We talk about a lot at FTNCI. That their need constituted a claim on my life. That it was my duty to contribute anything demanded of me. I came here to say that I do not recognize anyone's right to 1 minute of my life, nor to any part of my energy, nor to any achievement of mine, no matter who makes the claim, how large their number, or how great their need. I wish to come here and say that I am a man who does not exist for others. It had to be said. The world is perishing from an orgy of self-sacrificing. I wish to come here to say that the integrity of a man's creative work is of greater importance than any charitable endeavor. Those of you who do not understand this are men who are destroying the world. I wish to come here and state my terms. I do not care to exist on any others. I recognize no obligations toward men except one, to respect their freedom and to take no part in a slave society. To my country I wish to give the 10 years, which I will spend in jail if my country exists no longer. I will spend them in memory and in gratitude for what my country has been. It will be my act of loyalty, my refusal to live or work in what has taken its place. There I'll end the reading from the speech. I want to point out that within the conservatives who try to critique Ayn Rand's worldview, they often will say, well, don't you have any place for love and for loyalty? And those things matter too, not just individual rights and freedom, right? Well, who has loyalty here? He has loyalty to the nation in which he grew up, in which he was able to live the kind of life that he wanted. And people will criticize Ayn Rand's ideology and say, oh, well, that's just a propositional nation. No, Howard Roark is loyal to the nation, not just the proposition of freedom, but the fact that the nation existed in reality. So there's no problem there, and that's an empty criticism. And notice the parallel between his ethic and the ethic in Scripture. In Romans 13, we're told what our obligations are to the government. We ought to pay taxes. It's moral to pay taxes. It's moral to support their leadership and their exercising of judgment so that we can have peace in society. It is moral to pay taxes. And then right after that, Paul goes on and says, owe nothing to anyone except love for one another. Well, look at this. He has the same exact attitude toward his fellow man. I recognize no obligations toward men except one, to respect their freedom and to take no part in a slave society. Love your neighbor means taking no part in a slave society. Gospel Coalition, listen up. To take no part in a slave society. And he loves his country. Christian nationalist, he loves his country. We can learn a lot from Ayn Rand's understanding of what it is to love your country. We have just maybe 5 minutes more of discussion if anyone wants to add any thoughts to that. Go ahead, Greg.
A lot of the communist rhetoric we see out there, and that's really what it is. That's what we see from a lot of places like the Gospel Coalition, InterVarsity, a lot of these so-called Christian places, which are, and a lot of the people who are running these institutions are not Christians. It's really disgusting what a lot of them are doing. There are Marxists who have infiltrated the church. They're wolves and they need to be driven out. I once heard a pastor say that he tried to separate the sheep from the goats and the wheat from the tares in his church, but he realized he couldn't do it. I'm like, and it was maybe a wise thing that he said, but even with that, even if we can't separate the sheep from the goats, we still do need to drive out the wolves. And so you look at this rhetoric and this ideology they're pushing. If you want to go live in a commune and you want to, share everything together with your neighbor, and have, if that's how you want to live, more power to you. Go right ahead. A lot of the people pushing this communism stuff, it's not the poor. It's people who are very upper middle class, very well-to-do people who went to very expensive universities. So it's a lot of upper middle class people. So it's like, hey, you got the money, you have the quote-unquote capital, you have the wealth. If this is how you want to live, go live like that. But don't force me into your religion at the point of a gun. And because at the end of the day, that's what it is. Your communism, it's your religion, and you're trying to push it through violence, and it's not okay. So I think that's, despite whatever rhetoric they want to have about sharing and loving your neighbor and the poor, a lot of it's just euphemisms. It's just like how you have people out there who try to say, well, Jesus said love, therefore you have to accept all of this perversion. Jesus said help the poor, therefore you have to help the poor with your neighbor's money at the point of a gun. And it's like, no, that's not how it works. That's not what's being said, and any honest person knows that's not what's being said.
Amen to that. Well, FTNCI, ChristianIntellectual.com, is calling Christians to honesty. And the critiques that Ayn Rand leveled against the culture today are useful, even for Christians. And so join us in plundering the Egyptians and the pagans to see what is valuable in their work. We're going to continue in the next 2 weeks discussing the character speeches in Atlas Shrugged, which will be Francisco's several speeches and Hank Rearden's moving Courtroom speech. Thank you for joining us for this meeting of the New Intellectual Book Study. Please give this a like, give this a share or a comment. And you can find all of our readings listed at christianintellectual.com/intellectual. Please consider supporting For the New Christian Intellectual by becoming a regular donor. You can find out how to do that by going to christianintellectual.com/Patreon. We are equipping Christians to be defenders of reason, individualism, and capitalism, and through this work we aim to create a new American Renaissance. I look forward to talking with you again. God bless.